If you want to see something that will make you feel better, I suggest you skip the lines, save $9 or $10, and stay in front of the fire and watch Cleopatra instead. Hollywood has seen many stars, but Timothy Dalton is one of the few that was both right and wrong at the same time. He was the most true to the original James Bond story, but audiences turned their backs on him, while Daniel Craig was praised for bringing a serious, grounded Bond to the screen. Had done it 20 years earlier and gotten mixed reviews. Why had a talented actor like him only played Bond twice before disappearing? Why has he never married, even though he was enticing many leading ladies? Was he a lonely man who was always trying to avoid the spotlight and commitment? Timothy Dalton played Bond more honestly than ever before, but the public wasn't ready to accept him, and maybe that was their biggest mistake. Dalton was born in England and raised in the United States. His father was a British intelligence officer and had served in the Special Operations Executive (SOE) during World War II. His mother was American, which made him an American citizen, even though he grew up and spent most of his life in England. Dalton didn't want to be an actor or star in Hollywood movies. Instead, he wanted to be a strong man like his father, a soldier, a pilot, or even a real-life superhero. No one thought young Dalton would become an actor because he had always been drawn to a life of discipline, accuracy, and real-world action. As a teenager, Dalton joined an air cadet training program to prepare for a career in the military or the aerospace industry. For a long time, he dreamed of becoming an astronaut and exploring space, from the blue skies to journeys beyond the Earth's atmosphere. But fate had other plans for him one day. When Dalton walked into a theater and saw Shakespeare's Macbeth, everything changed. The power of the words, the intensity of the emotions on stage, and the way an actor could command a whole room with their voice blew him away. He was drawn into the world of Shakespeare, drama, and stories much bigger than himself. In that moment, his dreams of becoming a pilot, soldier, or intelligence officer went away completely. He knew this was his true path, one that would be full of challenges, glory, and pain. After the fateful shock of discovering Shakespeare, Timothy Dalton didn't waste any time starting on his new path. At age 18, he was accepted into the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, RADA, which is one of the best acting schools in England. But unlike many of his classmates, Dalton didn't like to wait around. He wanted to act right away. Before long, he made the brave decision to leave RADA without finishing his course. For others, it might have been a risky move, but for Dalton, it was a pivot. He took a calculated step and joined the National Theatre, where he studied classic plays and improved his acting skills on some of the world's most famous stages. Dalton Quee proved himself. With a deep, commanding voice, an air of aristocratic presence, and a piercing gaze, audiences were captivated and critics swiftly took notice. This was not just a talented actor, but a true star in the making. His performances in Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and Henry IV solidified his status as one of the biggest names on the British stage. Then, as if by fate, the doors to Hollywood opened and major directors started paying attention to Dalton. The big break came when he got the part of King Philip II of France in The Lion in Winter in 1968. The movie had a great cast, including Peter O'Toole, Katharine Hepburn, and Anthony Hopkins. But Dalton was anything but overshadowed. Timothy Dalton was never a typical film actor. He was a rebel who turned down safe roles and never chased fame. After The Lion in Winter's success in 1968, Dalton became one of the most famous actors of the 1970s. But to become a legend, an actor must leave a unique mark, and Dalton chose a path unlike any other. He turned down commercial roles in favor of films with deep psychological layers and complex, conflicted characters that let him fully use his piercing gaze and commanding voice. Cromwell, 1970, a historical drama about during the English Civil War, Dalton played Prince Robert, a nobleman caught in the whirlwind of power struggles. In Mary, Queen of Scots, 1971, he changed into Henry Darnley, the unfortunate husband of Queen Mary. Darnley was a character who seemed charming on the outside but was full of ambition and tragedy. When Dalton played Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, 1971 Heath, he didn't just play Heathcliff, he became Heathcliff. And that's when people realized. However, Timothy Dalton wasn't just another actor, he was a true artist. Even though he had a great reputation, Dalton still needed a role that was mysterious, dangerous, and passionately intense. In 1983, that role came up when he played the romantic figure Edward Rochester in Jane Eyre. Rochester wasn't your typical stoic gentleman. He was intense, he was mysterious at times, cold but full of desire, and when he spoke, his deep, razor-sharp voice drew people in. Every look, every word, every scene of the movie was a hit. Made Dalton an eternal romantic icon on screen. In 1986, Timothy Dalton stood on the stage of the Royal Theatre performing with Vanessa Redgrave, a woman he had once loved deeply. This was where he belonged, in the world of Shakespeare, where lines were weapons and stage lights were everything. But then he got a call from Aeon Productions. They wanted him to play James Bond, one of the most famous roles in movie history. For Dalton, it was a huge chance and an unmissable turning point, but it also raised the unsettling question of whether this was the worst trap Hollywood had ever set for him. The truth is that Dalton was familiar with the name James Bond. He had been offered the part before, in 1968, when Sean Connery first quit after You Only Lived Twice. At the time, producers thought a young actor like Dalton could carry on Connor's legacy, but he turned them down because he was only 22 years old. Dalton thought Bond had to be an experienced man. He couldn't be a young boy in a tuxedo awkwardly holding a Walter PPK. The part went to George Lazenby, and we all know how badly that turned out. But the story didn't end there. In 1971, when Connery left for the second time after Diamonds Are Forever, Dalton was again considered, but this time the producers chose Roger Moore, who played a very different kind of Bond. Moore was charming, funny, and lighthearted, and the franchise went in a more entertaining, far cry from Ian Fleming's original creation. Dalton was forgotten again. By 1981, Roger Moore was almost 54 and thinking about retiring. Dalton's name came up again, but Moore chose to stay on for a few more years, filming For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy again. Dalton missed his chance. In 1985, A View to a Kill was Moore's last appearance as Bond. This time, fate didn't wait, and Dalton became the fourth James Bond in movie history. No one knew that this choice would also mark the moment he took on the role. Dalton had no intention of playing Bond like Connery or Moore. He wanted to bring the character back to Ian Fleming's original vision of a cold, damaged agent who was more of a government tool than a flashy hero. Dalton spent months studying the character's mind by rereading every Bond novel. He wanted people to see Bond as a real person, not just a womanizer who cracks jokes during high-speed chases. With determination, he created a whole new Seven in the Living Daylights, 1987. The movie had a good script, did well at the box office, and got good reviews from critics, but audiences weren't ready for this kind of Bond. For over a decade, they had been used to a charming and funny Seven who could kill a man with one hand while flashing a cheeky smile. Dalton didn't do that. He didn't flirt like Roger Moore or smirk after action scenes. He was sometimes a serious and realistic Bond, which made people feel uncomfortable. 2 years later, he came back with License to Kill, 1989, a violent, dark, and grittier Bond movie than any that had come before. This time, Bond wasn't just on a mission, he was looking for revenge. He was torn between justice and his own feelings, and he was ready to kill without hesitation. The movie was too different from the typical image of James Bond, so people didn't like it. But Dalton never got the chance to prove he was right. Soon after, a real nightmare hit the Bond franchise. In 1990, MGM, the studio in charge of distributing the films, got into a legal battle with Aeon Productions, which put the next Bond movie off indefinitely. Meanwhile, Dalton stayed under contract with the studio and had to wait. He couldn't take on other major roles because he was still tied to Aeon's management, so he spent almost 5 years in limbo, in not quite Bond, but also not able to be anyone else. By 1993, MGM finally released the next Bond movie. After the company's legal problems were over, they decided to relaunch the franchise in a more commercial and mainstream way. They wanted Dalton back, but this time they wanted a long-term contract, committing him to multiple Bond films. For Dalton, this was a prison sentence he had to wait too long for, and had missed too many opportunities. By that time, Bond wasn't the role he wanted to keep playing. On April 12, 1994, Timothy Dalton officially quit as James Bond. Just 2 months later, Pierce was introduced as the new James Bond, and 1995 became a worldwide hit, bringing the Bond franchise into a dazzling new era. Brannan had the charm of Connery and the elegance of Moore, but he was also serious enough to echo what Dalton had brought to the role, making Bond glamorous enough to be loved by audiences, but not too different from Fleming's original character to be criticized. While Brannan was in the spotlight, Dalton pretty much disappeared from Hollywood. When asked if he regretted leaving Bond, Dalton said he didn't. He had never liked the idea of playing the part for too long, but when he quit, it put an end to his career. In the years that followed, he was only in a few TV shows and smaller projects. He never got another role as prestigious as James Bond. Perhaps the funniest part of this story was when Daniel Craig played Bond for the first time in Casino Royale in 2006. Audiences praised him for being realistic, cruel, and deeper than ever before. They now looked up to Timothy Dalton. Maybe Dalton wasn't It's still a mystery whether Hollywood missed out on the perfect James Bond because audiences weren't ready for him yet. On screen, Timothy Dalton played cold, mysterious, and proud men, but in real life he loved just as passionately as the men he played. It wasn't just a simple romance, it was a beautiful yet tragic love story between a man who feared commitment and a woman who longed for a relationship. As with many passionate but troubled relationships, it didn't end happily ever after. In 1971, Dalton met Vanessa Redgrave on the set of Mary Queen of Scots. He was a young 25-year-old actor and she was 34. She was a famous actress with a long career, a husband, and children of her own. She was a mature, intelligent, and commanding woman who was very different from the young, carefree women Hollywood usually paired its leading men with, but Dalton didn't care about the age gap or social barriers. From the start, Dalton was drawn to Vanessa not because of her fame or beauty, but because of her fierce personality. Vanessa Redgrave was independent, proud, and a fire that dared to be challenged. Like a man who never backs down from a challenge, Dalton was determined to pursue her at any cost, and they started a relationship that broke all the rules. Vanessa had a family, but she didn't turn Dalton away. Their love grew quickly, intense, passionate, and all-consuming. Even though they worked together, acted together, walked the red carpet together, and went through the ups and downs of the movie business together, they never got married. At first, it didn't matter. They were two creative souls who didn't want to be limited by social norms. But as time went on, it became clear that they had different hopes and dreams for the future. Vanessa wanted a real family. She wanted to have children with Dalton to have a permanent bond, but Dalton never wanted to get married because he didn't believe in eternal love. For over a decade, they were in love but unable to move forward because Dalton lived his life on his own terms and wouldn't change for anyone, not even the woman he loved the most. Vanessa, on the other hand, needed something more certain, something Dalton could never give her. Eventually, when their differences could no longer be resolved, they broke up. There were no fights, SC candles, or messy lawsuits like so many Hollywood stories do. After their breakups, Vanessa continued her career and built her own life, while Dalton retreated to his world as a man who never made commitments. In a cruel twist of fate, Dalton would find himself in another passionate relationship that would end in separation and betrayal. In 1995, when he was getting close to 50, he met Oksana Grigorieva, a young and beautiful Russian singer and pianist who was almost 20 years younger than him and had the mysterious beauty of there was something irresistible about Oksana that made her different from Vanessa Redgrave. She wasn't a woman of the stage or a strong, independent actress who challenged him. Instead, she made him feel like the center of attention, a strong man who could protect a weak woman, which is what drew him to her. Their relationship quickly became passionate and seemed to be the exact opposite of Dalton's previous relationship with Vanessa, who had made him struggle between his desire for freedom and the expectations of a strong woman. Oksana let him stay in charge. He could love without worrying about being tied down, but even when everything seemed perfect, Dalton still wouldn't walk down the aisle. As passionate and intense as their love was, Dalton remained Dalton, a man who would never let himself be bound by anyone. Even when Oksana got pregnant with their son, he didn't change his mind. When Alexander was born in 1997, Dalton took full responsibility as a father, providing for his son. He did everything for his child, and always said that Alexander was the best thing in his life. But that didn't mean he would become a husband. It seemed like a formula that Dalton thought could last forever. Passionate love, no marriage, no commitments, just desire and freedom. But he was wrong. Oksana wasn't Vanessa. She didn't wait, and she wasn't faithful. One day, everything fell apart. Rumors started to spread that Oksana was seeing someone else. Not just any man, but Peter Blomqvist. Dalton was a Swedish millionaire who could give her everything she wanted. A marriage proposal, a life of luxury, and the security she craved. When the rumors came true, Dalton didn't argue or beg. He knew this was going to happen for a long time. He quietly ended the relationship, keeping his pride but carrying a wound deeper than any role he had ever played. But what made Dalton different was that he never let his anger affect his son, while many men would have. Even though he broke up with Oksana, Dalton remained a devoted father. He took care of Alexander and spent time with him. And even though he was no longer with Oksana, he never turned his back on the mother of his child. The story seemed to be over, but Oksana Grigorieva wasn't done yet. A few years later, she was in a high-profile relationship with Mel Gibson, who was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood at the time. Unlike her quiet breakup with Dalton, this one turned violent. Following the birth of their daughter Lucia together in 2009, Oksana suddenly accused Gibson of domestic abuse, filing a restraining order and saying that he had violently assaulted her. But the situation didn't end there. Later, leaked audio recordings shocked the public as they showed Gibson threatening to kill Oksana and making slurs about black people. Police were called and Gibson was taken to court where he was found guilty. Gibson was given 3 years of probation, told to go to counseling, and told to do community service. The scandal almost destroyed his career. He went from being a top Hollywood star to an outcast, losing multi-million-dollar deals and being turned down by many of his peers in the industry. Amid all this chaos, one strange truth remained. Timothy Dalton was the only man who had ever loved Oksana without complaining about her in public, getting into legal battles, or saying anything bad about her. Rather than going on the media to condemn her like Mel Gibson did, he kept quiet, kept his pride, and did what he needed to do as a father. Looking back at the whole situation, one question remains. Was Dalton truly betrayed, or had he put himself in a position where he would be left behind as a man who didn't believe in commitment but expected loyalty? Regardless of the answer, one thing is certain. Timothy Dalton is still alone, and maybe that was the life he had always wanted. Timothy Dalton is a classic example of a pioneer who was forgotten because he came too soon. He brought James Bond back to Ian Fleming's original vision, but audiences didn't like it. 20 years later, when Daniel Craig played a grittier, colder, and more realistic Bond, people hailed it as a revolution, but Dalton had already done it in the 1986. Audiences weren't ready for him at the time. This unfairness isn't just the opinion of Dalton's fans. Christopher Nolan, one of the most acclaimed directors of the 21st century, openly praised Dalton as the most true-to-life version of Bond from Fleming's books. Nolan even said he wanted to base a Bond movie on Dalton's spirit because he thought it was the most accurate portrayal of the character. Dalton's story is a tragedy of misjudged innovation. If License to Kill had come out in the early 2000s instead of 1989, it might have been hailed as a masterpiece, but because it didn't. Timothy Dalton wasn't a failure, he was just ahead of his time in Roger Moore's lighthearted take on the role. It wasn't until Daniel Craig's success that people started to realize this. But Bond wasn't the only legacy Dalton left behind. He didn't let Hollywood's neglect consume him. In the years that followed, Dalton continued to show remarkable versatility in his acting. He refused to be defined by Bond, proving that he wasn't just an actor with one role. Before fading into obscurity, he left a strong mark on television with Penny Dreadful, a gothic horror series in which he gave an amazingly profound and layered performance. This was no longer the young Shakespearean actor, nor the coldly calculated Z7. This was a seasoned performer, bringing the depth and experience of a long and storied career to the screen. In Doom Patrol, where he once again showed that he could turn even the strangest roles into iconic ones by playing the chief of a mysterious game. He wasn't supposed to be James Bond or a Hollywood superstar. Dalton could command the screen just by his talent. But maybe his most surprising contribution came from an animated movie. When Toy Story 3 came out and became a worldwide hit, not many people knew that Timothy Dalton was in the Academy Award-nominated masterpiece. It was a movie that was very different from what he usually did, but Dalton still managed to leave his mark on one of the most... What is Timothy Dalton's true legacy? Is he a forgotten Bond actor who was left by Hollywood, or is he an unsung legend whose value is only now starting to be fully understood? Maybe Dalton never needed fame. He never wanted to be the kind of star Hollywood wanted. He just wanted to act and dedicate himself to the craft in his own way. And maybe one day Hollywood won't see Timothy Dalton as the forgotten Bond, but as the one who set the stage for everything that came after. It was never a question of whether Dalton succeeded or not. The real question is whether people will ever have the insight to see that he succeeded a long time ago. At 79, While many of his contemporaries have married and enjoyed the comforts of home life, Dalton has never married. He is the only James Bond who has never had a wife and has never been tied to anyone, as if the character he played had written his fate in real life. But Dalton is not a man trapped in solitude by tragedy. He has chosen it as a way to live, a way of life that doesn't involve social media, scandals, or going to fancy events. Instead of Hollywood's fancy parties, he enjoys fishing in the Pacific, listening to jazz, and collecting rare antiques. He is a man who moves at his own pace in the middle of the chaos of the industry and always keeps a safe distance from the spotlight. Despite avoiding Hollywood's fancy parties, Dalton has kept a close bond with his only son Alexander, whom he shares with Oksana. Alexander is now 28 years old and lives in the United States. He is an adult, and even though he and his father don't live together, they stay close by staying in touch and meeting up whenever they can. To Dalton, Alexander is the most important thing in his life, and even though he may not be a man of marriage, he has never wavered in his role as a father. Even more surprising is that Dalton has kept a good relationship with Oksana Grigorieva, despite everything that happened between them in the past. There is no anger, no bitterness, no public fights like the one between Oksana and Mel Gibson. When Oksana went to court with Gibson, Dalton publicly backed her up, saying that the past was over and that their son's future was what mattered most. In a world where scandals and bad blood often tear relationships apart, Dalton stays calm and respectful, which has always set him apart from many of Hollywood's leading men. He rarely goes public, but he is sometimes seen at Manchester United games, City Stadium cheering for his favorite football team. He isn't James Bond anymore on screen, but he still walks with the elegance of an English gentleman and lives his life on his own terms, not looking for approval from others. Perhaps this is the perfect picture of Timothy Dalton, a lone wolf free from social expectations, but never lonely. Hollywood may have forgotten about him, but he never needed Hollywood to define his worth. Timothy Dalton was the James Bond that people weren't ready for. Even though he wasn't the most popular Bond, he was definitely one of the most memorable. He was a pioneering man who never gave up on his ideals and chose his own path instead of chasing fame or societal expectations. He turned down marriage and Hollywood's glamour, but never gave up on his true self. In a world that was always changing, Dalton stayed true to himself as a cold but dignified gentleman, a true lone wolf. Maybe if people back then had seen him, if more had been known about Timothy Dalton, he would not only be a forgotten legend, but also the best James Bond of all time. But even if Hollywood moves on without him, people who really know James Bond will always know that Dalton set the stage for everything that came after. What do you think about Timothy Dalton? Was he the right Bond at the wrong time? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting stories. Who knows, after rewatching The Living, after seeing Daylights and License to Kill, you'll understand that Timothy Dalton was never a forgotten James Bond. We were just slow to recognize him as a great actor.